Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. In 2021, the Green Finance Institute identified a funding shortfall of around £20 billion for Scotland's nature recovery. Now, Community Land Scotland has published The Credibility Gap for Green Finance, new research and analysis which critiques the supposed green finance gap. The research challenges claims that Scotland needs to rely on private enterprise and rich donors to ensure nature recovery. Josh Doble is the policy manager for Community Land Scotland. I asked him how much is currently allocated to nature recovery from the public purse.
So I think we need to be clear when we're talking about nature recovery in this kind of in this sense. It's quite narrowly defined. So what we're talking about here really is peatland restoration, woodland creation, and woodland maintenance. And there's two key areas of grant support for nature recovery at the moment in Scotland. There's also some limited support for deer management. But not very much, and we won't particularly get into that because what we're really talking about here is peatland restoration and woodland creation. So there's £250 million for peatland restoration up to 2030. So that's been a 10-year allocation. And for woodland, there's a forestry grant scheme. So that's currently under review, but between 2014 and 2020, that was 252 million. A lot of that money, it's worth saying, goes to commercial forestry plantation. And it's also worth pointing out that the annual budget for the Scottish Government is about 56 billion. So we're talking about 0.007% of the Scottish budget. And I suppose the really key thing to get across here, because it's very, very relevant for the paper that we published last week, is that for both peatland restoration and woodland creation, both of these are underspent. In 2020, about 14 million was spent on native woodland expansion. Only 1.6 million was spent on managing native woodland. And in none of the first 3 years of the Peatland Action Programme was more than half of the budget spent, half of the annual budget spent. So we need to get to the heart of why these grant mechanisms aren't being used. It's not as if these grant schemes are hugely oversubscribed and there's a financial kind of underspend here that we need private finance for. So we need to understand why landowners... So, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, the way that you framed it there, it's very much nature recovery to help deliver net zero rather than a sort of a more broad understanding of nature recovery.
Yeah, which I absolutely agree with, and I don't think that that's necessarily a helpful way of thinking about nature recovery. But what we're talking about here really is the mechanisms that are in place, the Scottish Government has put in place, rather than our understanding of what nature recovery should be. We have a much more holistic understanding of what that should be in terms of ecosystem regeneration. But the mechanisms that exist at the moment in Scotland are focused on peatland restoration, woodland creation, and you're right, that is absolutely tied to net zero, which is a thing in and of itself, which is probably a separate conversation to have about whether or not that's the best approach.
Indeed.
But that being said, they are the mechanisms in place, and that's why there is this call for private finance, is to try and speed up the use of these mechanisms. There isn't a discussion about private finance coming in for a more holistic kind of ecosystem recovery.
Now, the report contests the idea that there's a £20 billion funding shortfall. How much do you think it is?
What the actual gap may be, we need to leave to experts to work out. We're really just pointing out that this figure is vastly inflated and that there needs to be more public debate about this, and there needs to be more research. And we know that the Scottish Government is producing some updated figures on this, and from the work that John Hollingdale did, which we published, in conversations, as I thought it may be less than that by a factor of about 10. But really what we're calling for is just more information about what the finance gap may be. And it's worth bearing in mind, or all of us thinking about the fact that there'll be a finance gap in every area of government. Every area of public spending, there's a finance gap. Think about what it would be in health or education. But we don't necessarily say that finance gap needs to be addressed by privatisation or selling off those assets. We have a conversation about how we address that.
Why is Community Land Scotland concerned about the use of private funding for nature recovery?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And on the one hand, we have a kind of an ethical or a moral point which raises concerns about the financialization of nature. That's not something that we're necessarily comfortable with. Something that is so intrinsic to our biology, our culture. It's kind of existentially important for us as a species. How can that be broken down into financial units or its value attributed just based on kind of market economics? But then, so that's a kind of philosophical point. But then on the more practical point, we have concerns about the impact this is having on the Scottish land market, which is completely unregulated. The Scottish Land Commission earlier this year published a report which set out why land prices have been rocketing. And, a lot of that's driven by commercial forestry, and a lot of it's driven by this natural capital market. And this increase in land prices has deprived communities of the opportunity to buy land. We also see that this kind of focus on private funding isn't actually replacing public funding. It's public money being used to de-risk private investment. So it puts the risk onto the public and secures private profit. And to us, that just seems unreasonable. And in publishing this paper, what we're really calling for is a kind of proper political debate about this. There hasn't been a discussion about this, and we think we need to have that so we can think about how it aligns with other policy objectives around land reform, community wealth building, and a just transition to net zero.
Now, you talked earlier about the monetization of nature, and yet whether it's private funding or public funding, there needs to be some assessment of that, the value of the nature, in order to make sure that the money is put in place. Is there anything in particular that makes Community Land Scotland particularly concerned about the use of private funding for nature recovery?
But I think it's the point that this is the key crisis facing us as a species, and all mechanisms need to be used. But public funding, what we're thinking about here is really the public interest, public benefit. It's in everyone's interest for this to be resolved. Why does it need market mechanisms to achieve that? Because we know that public money has to be used to support the private investment anyway. So why don't we just use public investment to secure public benefit? There's no need to marketize this because we don't understand the motivations or where that money may be coming from. And if we think about the just transition, as you raised earlier, which so much of this is focused on, we need to be thinking holistically about emissions reduction, how we change our lifestyles, consumption patterns. And I don't think that essentially diving into a carbon market where we're not clear about who's buying the credits, it just seems entirely murky, where we all accept this is a public benefit that needs to be done. And in previous, in history, if you think about social housing or the National Health Service, when there's a crisis and it needs resolving, you need leadership from the government to step in and take a hold of the situation.
Now, Josh, in your view, is private funding already negatively impacting Scottish communities?
Yes. So we would argue this in land prices, but also in other ways. And I should stress that this isn't linked to the memorandum of understanding that Nature Scotland signed. This isn't operational yet, and specifically doesn't aim to buy land. So this is kind of a conversation moved away from that specific angle. But if we think about private finance in general operating under the guise of nature recovery or the climate crisis, we've seen private investors, hedge funds, banks buying up estates and other land for inflated prices, either outbidding communities or communities just don't even get a look in. So we've seen this happen at the Faralia estate, which is owned by Aberdeen hedge fund. Brewdog have done it as an attempt to kind of greenwash some of their activities. Highlands Rewilding, it happened in Tavialach in Argyll. And Oxygen Conservation, who are this very amorphous private finance group, have been buying up estates in Perthshire, two estates in Perthshire, also down in the borders, with a vague idea of something to do with nature recovery. But it's not clear what the motivations are here. And communities haven't been consulted about the land use change. They haven't had an option of buying any of the land. I should stress that the outlier to that is Tavialach, where Highlands Rewilding and the community there have started to have some really productive negotiations, and we're quite interested in what's going on there, and we think there could be a model.
And finally, do you see any role for private finance, and how else would you like to see nature recovery funded?
Yeah, so I think there's absolutely a place for private finance. We're in talks with Nature Scott about how any private investment might benefit communities and work with Scottish government policy objectives. But as I was saying earlier, the evidence seems to point to private finance is unable to deliver nature recovery without subsidy at this stage. As I was saying before, if we think this is, well, we all accept this is the existential crisis facing us. We need the government to take leadership, identify the problem, whatever it is, be it financial or otherwise, and try to resolve it. And aside from funding, there are some key opportunities coming up in Scotland in legislation to strengthen regulations. So in the land reform bill, there's a couple of mechanisms, land management plans and a land rights and responsibilities statement, which could ensure that landowners address degraded land. So this is a kind of carrot and stick of grant mechanism and also regulation. This would also have the impact of preventing the speculative purchase of land for carbon credits or as a financial hedge for wealthy investors to ride out inflation and the encroaching impacts of climate change. And let's be clear, this kind of concentrated land ownership that Scotland has seen for for centuries isn't beneficial for the climate. There's a couple of examples of estates doing nature recovery, but most estates are being held and sat on as a kind of financial asset rather than anything really transformational happening. And it's worth saying that, we're talking a lot about private finance or public finance, but we've also got examples of communities doing a lot and taking a lead on nature recovery, using grant mechanisms or other sources of funding, starting to explore what the carbon market might mean for them.
That was Josh Doble from Community Land Scotland. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back tomorrow when I'll speak to Nature Scot to discuss their response to the Community Land Scotland report. Thanks for watching.